Okay. Thank you, council members, for allowing us to come in and provide a quick presentation on a school zone study that we have undertaken with the help of a consultant. And what we did was it was citywide.
Liz, 1 second. I got to announce that we have an opens meeting document in the back right of the room. We are in accordance with LB 898.
And actually, I should also introduce myself. I apologize. Liz Elliott. I am the Director of Lincoln Transportation and Utilities Department. So this was a study that LTU undertook to look citywide at all school zones. And the purpose of this was to help us develop standards for school zones so that we were consistent with what was going on nationwide, but also that we can be consistent citywide as well. So what I'm going to actually do is allow the expert, our traffic engineer, Mark Luja-Harms, to actually walk us through this project, what it means, and how we will start implementing the new school zone standards citywide. Thank you.
Thanks, Liz. Good afternoon, council members. Again, Mark Luja-Harms, manager of the Traffic Engineering Division with Lincoln Transportation Utilities. And I have Melissa Ramos-Lamley with me this afternoon, and she's going to help out with the presentation as well. So, as Liz mentioned, this is a multi-year effort in which we did a study to look at making current, if you will, standards within our school zones. And those have then led to a set of standards that we're then moving forward with applying to all of our 83 public and private schools, elementary, middle, and high school. So just want to summarize with you a little bit about the process of the study, but dig into more details on the actual standards that we propose to implement citywide over the next several years. So can you see my slides? Okay, great. I should have asked that before I started. Quick agenda for our presentation. Again, just a real quick look at the process and the background that led into the study. Talk about the standards themselves, and then Melissa will share most of the details as to how we propose to implement those, again, at all of our 83 schools. So again, the purpose of this overall process was to enhance safety around the schools and along the walking routes that students or kids and families take to get to the schools, and while also developing some consistency in the devices, the traffic control devices, markings, signs, signalization that we're applying across the city. Because I'll be honest, over the years that we've implemented this without a set of consistent standards, there's not a whole lot of consistency citywide. And so one of the things that we're trying to do is make it apparent to drivers as they're approaching school zones that they recognize that they're in a school zone and have a lot of the same and similar treatments from one school zone to the next. As Liz mentioned, we were led by a national expert, Tool Design Group. They have offices across the country, and they have a lot of focus in the areas of active transportation, pedestrians, bicyclists, and other forms of micromobility. And again, a lot of this was geared at trying to adopt a lot of national best practices that we have been using, but haven't necessarily been formally documented in a set of standards specific to schools like what we are proposing here. And then finally, we were guided by a citizen panel. We had a roughly 12-person, don't quote me on that number, but a citizen panel made up of staff, made up of various folks in the community that were kind of a sounding board for this process and the standards that we came up with. And so that was an important part of this process. So regarding the standards that we have adopted themselves that came out of this study, that was in my one slide summary, they're essentially boiled down into these three categories. Designation and definition of what a school zone is, some definition or some standards along the lines of reducing speeds within our school zones, and then finally establishing criteria for crosswalk treatments along school walking routes that are leading to the various schools that we're looking at. So first, let's talk about that first category, the school zone itself. For the purposes of the recommendations that came out of this process and that are in our standards, the school zone is identified as the school property boundary plus all streets and intersections immediately adjacent to school property. And hopefully you can see the example there. This is just a hypothetical school. It doesn't represent any specific school in Lincoln, a hypothetical school with definitions of the property lines and the streets around it. And what is in green would be identified as the school zone. Does that make sense? Okay.
I have a question, Mark.
Absolutely.
Or do you want us to hold our questions to the end?
That's up to you.
What do you
So I
think? You want to
don't-
wait till the end, or?
Well, it deals with the school zone. I'm
Yeah, take them as they come and we'll do them quickly.
quickly, I'm perplexed. Why wouldn't you have included that corner? Because
They didn't own it.
they don't own it, that's okay, but still students might live across the street and have to cross that street over on that side.
Yeah, I think this really gets down in part to how far do you take it? Because you could continue to make that argument block by block because you're continually going to have some number of students that are coming from a given destination to the school. A lot of the national best practice and the guidance that we found and our consultant brought to us was the more you identify school zones, and the reason it's important is because of the traffic control devices that we're going to implement in the school zone. And again, it's really trying to draw attention to the fact that you're in a special area, an area that should draw greater concern to the motorists than even a location that's a half block or a block away. So maybe if I get into the next slide, it might help to explain that a little bit. But this here is a slide that shows the signage that would be very unique to the school zone definition and the geography of the school zone versus signage that you might see elsewhere. And from left to right across the screen are the signs I'll describe and the signs that you would likely see in the order as if you were a motorist approaching a school or approaching a school zone. So the first is this school zone sign that's on the left. That is a sign that would be in advance of the actual school zone geography or boundaries itself, saying, okay, you as a driver, you're entering a special place, a place where you want to have greater awareness of what's going on and to be expecting significant pedestrian activity, specifically school-age children activity. Secondly, you will see a sign that reduces the speed limit, and I'll talk in more specificity about the reduced speeds in the next category of information. And then also when you are at a crosswalk within the school zone itself, you would see first this sign that indicated a school crosswalk is ahead, and then with that plaque that has the downward diagonal arrow, that would be a sign at a crosswalk within a school zone itself. And that's unique because when we have crosswalks, which we will and we do outside of the school zone, it would just be your typical pedestrian sign and not a sign that is this pentagon shape with the likes of school children on the legend of that sign. The purpose of the reduced speed zones is predicated on the fact that higher speeds are associated with the greater likelihood of either severe injury and in sometimes fatal crashes, the higher speed when and if there is a collision between a vehicle and a pedestrian. And so one of the key changes that we will be proposing and implementing with these standards is now you are familiar with our reduced speed zones being at 25 miles an hour. These set of standards now propose taking that down to 20 miles an hour just because of that greater likelihood of anyone surviving a crash should there be one between a pedestrian and a vehicle. Now how we portray that reduced speed to motorists is going to vary depending on the type of street that the reduced speed limit is on. So if we are in a residential neighborhood on a local street and that local street is immediately adjacent to the school, we would be using a sign that says reduced speed limit 20 miles an hour with a plaque that is new to Lincoln that says when children are present. And we've been working with LPD, we work in the law department to make sure that we have appropriate code changes to implement that. And we've talked through that at quite a bit of length. So again, that is on streets that typically have a base, I'll call it, base posted speed limit of 25 miles an hour. Again, neighborhood feel, local streets, we would just be using the sign that says when children are present. And I do want to point out that I forgot to mention, but it relates to the school zone, is with these standards, the reduced speeds would only be applicable to streets that are immediately adjacent to the school or within the school zone. Right now, we have reduced speed zones on all varieties of streets, regardless of their location with respect to the school and regardless of the type or classification of the street. And so that's one of the things that we will be proposing with these set of standards, that if the street is not immediately adjacent to the school, we will not be including reduced speed zones on those streets. The second category of streets is streets that have a base posted speed limit of 30 or 35 miles an hour. In those cases, we will continue to use our flashing beacons that we currently use, where the flashing beacons come on 30 minutes before school and 30 minutes at the end of the school, as the way to indicate to motorists that the reduced speed limit is 20 miles an hour. The third category, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of schools that fit this, but we do have a few schools that are adjacent to streets that have posted speed limits of 40 or 45 miles an hour. Our traffic engineering Bible, or the manual uniform traffic control devices, limits our ability in terms of how big of a gap between the base posted speed limit and the reduced posted speed limit, how fast and how we can increment that speed limit down. Unfortunately, it limits us to 15 miles an hour. So if we're 20 miles an hour or above what we're trying to get to, we have to find some other way. And so what the consultant has done is given us a little bit of liberty, I suppose, in doing more thorough evaluation for those roughly a half dozen schools to identify what is the proper way. Do we perhaps reduce the reduced speed limit to 25 rather than 20? Do we reduce the base posted speed limit down from 40 or 45 down to 35? Those are the types of things that we'll have to look at in more detail based on the context of the school for those few schools that do have adjacency to streets with higher speed limits. Any questions there? I know that might have been a lot to digest, but that is a key outcome of this in terms of two big changes. One is going from 25 to 20 as our reduced speed limit, and B, only doing that on streets that are immediately adjacent to schools. The third category is then crossing treatments at crosswalks along, both within school zones as well as along the walking routes. And Melissa will get into that a little bit. But essentially, as we identify and define these walking routes from a given neighborhood location or primary generator to the school, those primary crosswalk or primary routes will cross streets, and we'll need to identify whether or not they are relevant to receive certain types of treatments. And those could be signalized and non-signalized locations that are summarized there in the bottom set of bullets. And then finally, I want to mention to you in terms of the design principles. So the recommended school crossing treatments, that there's a whole wide variety in the back of our standards that we look into as ways to safely accommodate pedestrians at crosswalks, are really designed around these 5 design principles. And I'm not going to read them, but essentially all of the crossing treatments that we have in our toolbox, so to speak, are aimed at achieving at least one, if not multiple, of these design principles. And that's what's kind of our guiding force in terms of identifying what is the proper crossing treatment for these various locations. And then within our standards, I know you can't read all this, and it wasn't intended to be able to, but these 4 categories of crossing types, we then have a whole host of criteria that we look into to identify what is the proper treatment, whether it's just a signed and marked crosswalk, whether it's an RRFB or a rectangular rapid flashing beacon, or if it's a full signalized crosswalk. And so we have this detail for the 4 categories. So the first category, again, was a signalized intersection. The second being a stop-controlled approach crossing. That's just either a 4-way stop or a 2-way stop, so it's for the approaches that are stop sign controlled. We then have a signal at a mid-block that's just primarily a pedestrian signal. And then an uncontrolled crossing, so an intersection that doesn't have stop sign control on the specific leg. And so those are the different categories we look into. And like I said, we have a whole toolbox or host of then treatments that we can apply based on that criteria for the given type of crosswalk. Melissa's going to spend a little bit of time with you just to kind of walk through with you how we then take these standards and implement them at a given school.
Excuse me, before you depart, did you tell us what the crosswalk treatment would be, like on the pavement? Is any of that changing?
So again, on the pavement itself, no, it's not paint, it's a marking that's more durable. It's a material that's supposed to last 2 to 5 years. But for whenever we have a crosswalk, what we put on the pavement itself is pretty common to what we currently have in place.
Sorry, I'm cut on my glasses here. Good afternoon. So I'm just going to give you a quick overview of how we apply the standards to a school. I'll be using Human Elementary, located in the Cripple Creek neighborhood, as an example. First, we identified the school zone, which is shown on the map there in pink. It's identified as the school property boundary, like Mark said, plus all the streets and intersections adjacent to the school. We then apply the school signage, which includes the school zone sign, the reduced speed zone signs, and the end school zone sign. Existing crossing locations and the traffic control devices are added to the map. If the school has an established traffic plan, which is shown in purple there, that is also drawn in. All of this information allows us to have a clear picture of the existing conditions around the school. We then move on to establishing the primary walking route. We create a half-mile buffer around the school, which represents the potential school walk zone. The red dots you see represent the students that attend Human Elementary. We're looking to identify the routes which will serve the greatest number of students and where crosswalk treatment should be installed. Here you see we've identified the shortest path to school for each of the 283 students living within the potential walk zone. The lines are color-coded based on how many students are on that particular segment. Transportation staff then analyze this information, taking into consideration not only where the students currently reside, but where they're likely to live in the future. Our goal is to establish a route that will serve the students and the school for a number of years to come. Once the walking route has been established, all of the possible crossing locations are identified and placed into a database to determine the appropriate treatments to apply. The recommendations are based on the type of traffic control present, the posted speed limit, the number of lanes being crossed, and traffic volumes. This map shows our final recommendations. We've not only identified which locations meet the criteria for crossing treatments, but some that should be removed because they don't satisfy the standards. And then all of this information is pulled together into a memo for the affected school. This document provides background on the school zone study and explains the proposed changes. Our intention is to open communications with the school and give them an opportunity to comment and provide feedback to us. And we also want them to have all this information in a format they can easily share with their parents and their students.
One more slide. All the previous slides are pretty exciting to Melissa and myself, but maybe the gory details for you. This might be the slide that interests you the most in terms of how are we moving forward with this. To be honest, it's going to take us a while. With 83 schools and not a dedicated funding source, at least within our current budgets, it's going to take us a while. Again, we have 83 schools, and those schools are illustrated on the graphic there on the right side of the slide. So we fully envision that this is going to take multi-phases and multi-years to accomplish. Our best guess is at least 5 years, just based on the number of schools and how quickly we can get design work done, contractors interested, and again, funding. We are coordinating these activities with the schools, as Melissa mentioned. So we've been in, Scott Wieskamp with LPS was on our citizen panel, so they've been engaged from the get-go. And then as we develop a plan for each of the schools, as Melissa showed, we're developing a memo that we then send out to them that, for one, they can then use that to communicate to their families, as well as to give us some feedback as to whether or not we might be missing something in terms of those primary walking routes or otherwise. Furthermore, we're also looking for opportunities to coordinate implementation with the other projects that LTU is implementing. For instance, we have some residential resurfacing projects, and we're taking advantage of those opportunities to not go in and take away a crosswalk and then have to come back in at a later time to put them in. In terms of our implementation plan, we're starting simple. We fully anticipate that we may learn some things along the way, but we also recognize that there are going to be some things that, I don't know if controversy is the right word, but we will be removing things that folks have been used to over the last several years. We may be converting some full signalized pedestrian crossings to our RRFB crossings. There will be locations where we currently have identified reduced speed zones on streets that aren't immediately adjacent to schools. Over time, we would be proposing to remove those. And so we want to build some momentum and gain some success and support, certainly from you, but also the community and the schools themselves. But recognize there will be some bumps along the way in terms of some things we have to overcome in regards to those things that we might be removing. Regarding funding, we still have a lot of implementation plans to develop. With this is not only signs and pavement markings and signals, but we also have a lot of curb ramps, wheelchair ramps to either add or repair to make compliant with ADA with this process. And so that alone is going to drive the price tag up quite a bit. But we are in conversations with the Nebraska Department of Transportation. There are some federal funds that we can pursue, safety-related funding. They are very excited about this project in terms of applying those funds to. There still is a local match that we will have to come up with to use that funding, but it's funding that we otherwise don't have. And so we are continuing to develop some applications to pursue those opportunities as we speak. With that, real quick, I wanted to show you a couple things. First of all, we have developed a website at traffic.lincoln.ne.gov, where we have a web page devoted to these school zone standards. You can see the entire document, and we'll continue to build on this as we go through implementation. And then also with our public information officer's leadership, Erica Hill in the back of the room, we will be beginning some social media campaigns regarding this topic of school zone standards. And so if you will indulge me, I'm just going to play a couple of the videos that we shot last week.
Hi, I'm Melissa with Lincoln Transportation and Utilities. Our transportation division recently completed a school zone study to ensure we meet national safety standards. Results of the study include updates to our school zone signage. The school zone sign indicates to drivers they're entering an area where extra care is needed for the safety of students and pedestrians. For more information about school zones, see our website at ltu.lincoln.ne.gov.
Didn't she do good?
Yeah, nice and clear.
Then I just set myself up for failure by showing Melissa's first.
Hi, I'm Mark with Lincoln Transportation Utilities Traffic Engineering Division. Safety is our top priority, including in our school zones. One of the ways in which we enhance safety is by providing treatments at our pedestrian crosswalks, like this RRFB, or Rectangular Rapid Flashing Beacon. By installing these at our school crosswalks, we bring greater awareness to pedestrian activity at our crosswalks, encouraging motorists to yield for pedestrians in the crosswalk. For more information, please visit ltu.lincoln.ne.gov.
And yes, I will stick with my day job. So that's hopefully a quick summary of the process and our standards and our plan moving forward. I don't know if Liz, if you have some concluding comments, but I'd be happy to take any questions if there are any.
I'm sure we have a bunch of questions.
No, and I did just want to add, before we get into questions, that we will be, as Mark indicated, we have worked with LPD and the law department on making some proposed amendments to ordinances, specifically defining that new signage of when children are present and what does that actually mean. So in the next couple weeks, you will see that on your agenda and some additional information coming along with those proposed ordinance changes to go along with these proposed changes as well. So, but with that, I'll open it up for questions.
Yes, Councilman Christensen.
So this is the first place I've ever lived, and I've lived a few places, where the school zones in residential areas were 25 miles an hour. And the speed limit in the residential area is 25 miles an hour. This is reducing it by 5 miles an hour. Is that what I'm understanding?
That is correct, yes.
Why not 15? Because I've lived in other places and it's been 15 in those places.
For a couple of reasons, I suppose. One is that based on the research that we've done, I certainly recognize that there are other communities that reduce their speeds to something different. That's certainly a possibility. The thing that we've really focused on, and we did quite a bit of safety statistical analysis to support this, is that the greater you make the reduction between what the base posted speed limit is and the reduced, which presents greater opportunities for there being variation in terms of what the drivers are actually driving. That variation is oftentimes what leads to crashes more so than the speed itself. Mm-hmm. So in most cases, we're trying to keep that spread of vehicular speeds as tight as we possibly can. And the more that you reduce the speed or go from a higher speed down to something else, the greater opportunity there is for increasing that spread. And that, again, is what creates crashes not necessarily severe crashes. I will tell you, speed certainly is a factor in the severity of the crash. But in terms of the number of crashes itself, it's usually what that spread of speed is.
Okay. Question, Councilperson Raybold.
So have you already introduced this to the Board of Education? And then is your next step going to be going out with your road show into the different districts of the city and inviting parents to weigh in? Or what is the plan going
Sure, great question. First of all, as I mentioned, from the get-go, Scott Wieskamp, if you know Scott, he's been involved in the process. He was on our citizen panel from the get-go. I'm in monthly meetings with Scott just related to general coordination items, and we've talked about this quite a bit there. And then we've also included him in the communications that we've had with the individual schools since we started developing a few of the implementation plans. I don't know, full disclosure, I don't know what communication Scott has had in terms of taking it to the board and that sort of thing. But in terms of our next plan, in addition to email correspondence with the schools when we lay out what the proposed changes are, I think later this week we will be generating a Zoom presentation recorded like this, and we'll be sending that out to the school principals as well, so they can see more details as to the background of the process, what goes into the standards, and they can use that information as they choose with their school families in terms of getting that message out.
Councilwoman Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I'm glad to see the speed limit going down in school zones. Thank you very much. But it really has to do with some communication. When you go out to an individual school, or when you've sent the information on, like you say that you will there be a point in the process with each implementation plan where the PTO has an opportunity to come into the process?
Liz, do you want to address that?
Parent teacher.
That is our goal, because we're pretty late in the season, and as Mark indicated earlier, we're going to do very basic, simple changes for this first season, but it is my hope and plans for next year and the bigger changes that we make to go in and hold meetings with them, whether we're still doing it virtually or if we're going in person by that time. But we will continue to have ongoing communications, especially with those schools that are affected. And again, this year it's just few and small changes, and as we get bigger changes, we'll make sure to have that proactively before the work or stuff starts.
Okay. And I just have two short, quick follow-ups. You mentioned implementation plans that you'd already begun some. I'd like to know which schools you started. And when you say few, but something changes, could you tell me, would you categorize what that means?
Yeah, so in terms of implementation, when we say we've started, that is only developing the plan. There's very little work that we've actually done out on the streets. Any work that we have done is cases where we've just gone out and put new pavement markings down over an already existing crosswalk, or refreshed a sign because it wasn't meeting the retro reflectivity standards that are prescribed to it. So nothing necessarily new per se that anyone would recognize other than just standard maintenance activities. So that's in terms of what we've done. Rousseau is an example of our first school that we've developed an implementation plan for. Human Elementary, help me, Melissa. St. Peter's. So a very small. And then in terms of the question on what we define as simple, I think was that your question, Councilwoman Washington? Mm-hmm. It's essentially pavement markings and very standard signing, like the signing necessary at a crosswalk, or the signing that's necessary to identify that you're coming into a school zone, as I defined. So non-simple would be removing a school zone flasher or changing a traffic signal to an RRFB, those types of things. So not only non-simple in terms of costs, but also things that the public would maybe grasp onto and say, what's going on here? So.
Okay. Any other questions? I have a few. One, can we get a copy of the presentation?
Yes.
Or is it online, or?
It's not.
But we will make sure that Michelle Abendroth will get that out with the minutes and everything,
Okay.
and have this attached, as well as a fact sheet for you.
Yep.
What definition of a school are we using? What constitutes a school?
Well, we are considering every school that we're applying these to would be elementary, middle, high school, public and private. Now there may be some one-offs there that I guess I'm not sure what you might be thinking of, Councilman. But
Mostly the private, daycare, preschools, at churches.
Certainly there.
Considered a school, Montessori school is. I mean,
Maybe that's something that we hadn't dug into. There's some pretty, I don't know if prominent's the right word, but obvious Catholic and Lutheran schools that have a pretty good student population that we would certainly be applying these to. I guess I'd be open to your guidance as to what that definition should be. Is it a certain number of students, or what the case may be?
I don't know. At this point, I don't know where you want to go with that. Because won't it be everybody that has a school, their posted speed limit would reduce, even if they had one class in their church, and the church owns a lot of property that has 4 arterials around it. All those arterial speeds would have to come down.
Yeah. I don't think the intention was to apply this to daycares, but recognize that there are some, Montessori schools, as you mentioned, or otherwise. That's something we'll definitely consider and think more about.
Yeah, and because they own property up against all these streets.
Sure.
And so what would designate them as a school?
We'll give that some more thought.
And we start getting into all the legal parts of that. You're talking about that we're going to be following a set of kind of national standards, is that correct? Is that somewhere we can find those national standards? Or then you also said that except for certain speed limits maybe, or?
Correct, yeah. The document itself references a lot of the standards that we're talking about. So if you went into the document that I showed online,
okay,
from which the standards were generated, there will be references in there, and we can certainly point you to those or provide those if you need some assistance finding those. Again, the exception that we're talking about with regards to speeds, again, is the manual and uniform traffic control devices limits our ability to take, as you're driving down a given street, limits our abilities to just go from 45 down to 20 with no other warning. You have to do it in steps or incremental processes to get from 45 down to 20 as an example. And so we do have a few schools. One is on 24th and Superior. I'm forgetting the name, Melissa. Campbell, thank you. Where Superior in that case, I believe, is 40 miles an hour. And so that's one where if we were trying to go from 40 to 20, that would contradict the guidance that we have in the manual and uniform traffic control devices, which is prescribed by law for the state of Nebraska and the city of Lincoln. And so we must follow that. And so that's a situation where we would want to decide or do some further evaluation of whether we'd want to change the reduced speed limit to something other than 20, say 25, because that would then allow us to fall within that 15 mile an hour range that we could drop without any other advance notification. Or we could propose to reduce the base posted speed limit. Instead of 40 miles an hour all the time, it could be 35. Or there's perhaps other strategies. There are dynamic speed limit signs that we could use. That by time of day, it could tell motorists that there's a revised speed limit ahead, and use that as a way to message to the motorists of what the changing speed limits are. So we have a few options available to us. We just need to identify which of those, or perhaps others, are appropriate for these roughly half a dozen to 10 schools that we have that are adjacent to streets with speed limits 40 miles an hour or above.
I'm just worried about Normal Boulevard going down there, because you got school, and what says school property? That one has a maintenance on the other side. It's owned by LPS. LPS owns Seacrest Field. So that will get shut down too for speed. A Street will. Is that correct? I mean, it's adjacent to LPS.
Yeah, that we would have to look at that. From my perspective, that would not necessarily be against school property. It might be against the district's property, but perhaps not against school property. And so we'll have to refine that
too. What's school and what is the district property, LPS, that would probably need to be defined also. A little, yeah,
I'd look at Lincoln, Lincoln East and go, well, 70th and A
yeah.
feels like that's the east boundary, not the district boundary. I realize it's a distance from the school front door, but
Mm-hmm.
And it's these issues as to why the phases are going to be multi-year, because it is going to take some time to really flesh out some of the details and just starting with the simpler ones that are easier to define and begin the process that way as we work out these bigger issues. And you've raised some good points on what technically is a definition of a school. So we'll work with the law department and LPD as we make these changes.
And you said this is the final recommendation.
Yes.
This has already been implemented or already being implemented.
We've adopted them.
You've
I guess you could
adopted
say,
them?
yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And then when you talk to Scott Wieskamp, just tell him he needs to be agile. Agility is a great thing. And so tell him I brought that up. He'll get a kick out of that.
All right, I will do that.
And I think Mark would echo this. LPS really has been a big supporter and proponent of this, and they've been great to work with and kind of laying out how do we do this and what's the best way to lay it out to their school families and make sure everyone's on board. And the social media that we'll be sharing with LPS so they can also push it out and share it that way as well. So
I just hope we have a lot of flexibility, agility to be able to do this right.
yeah.
Councilperson Bowers?
I think the only question, or I guess maybe statement that I have is, I know that there's neighborhoods in Northeast Lincoln that have some serious concerns about one stretch of road in particular. And, my predecessor led the charge in trying to put a school zone there. And I guess my question is, and you already kind of addressed this, and I don't know if it's a question or if I just want to kind of press this, is just making sure that the neighborhoods are involved, that they know about it, because I don't know if that trust is there right now with all of the neighborhoods in Northeast Lincoln, and trying to make sure and reassure that if this is the recommendation, the reasons behind that, and because I don't think that
Great.
that feeling of safety is currently there, and I don't know if it's going to get worse with some of these recommendations.
No, and that is a good point to bring up. Obviously, there were some prior resolutions that at some point we will need to probably address. But I do think that you bring point out a good issue that maybe we should be looking at doing some very specific public open houses to get feedback, provide this education, and do that well in advance of maybe proposing some recommendations on some new resolutions.
Councilperson Washington?
And I would just, I would ask that when you look at what a school is, however you come up with the definition of that you broadly announce this so that schools that might not have been on your radar come onto your radar. And there you engage with them as well. And certainly public involvement to the degree that you're asking them for input on their plan,
Right.
because it's also important to explain, give them the expectations that this has already been approved, you intend to implement this, but that you're looking specifically for how they can make changes to the plan that's in their neighborhood or around their school, and not the whole program.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Councilperson Schob?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll find the microphone. I'm sure you said it, and Mark and I kind of spaced on it. I'm used to driving down 13th Street and seeing the flashing beacons come on, or 33rd. I'm thinking, oh, okay, school's in session, this is school season, slow your ass down and keep going. Don't stop, just slow down. Except for the flashing beacons, those I'm supposed to stop at. Will this be the same idea where during school season that Chair said shutting it down? I think I'm not sure if he meant that as I seriously meant that, but it'll be timed, right? In the morning, in the afternoon, the speeds drop.
Yeah,
The rest of the time, it goes back to normal speed.
correct. So again, there's two ways in which we'll be communicating to motorists that there is a reduced speed. One, again, is on those residential streets that have a base posted speed limit of 25. There'll just be a plaque under the reduced speed limit sign that says when children are present. For the streets that have base posted speed limits of 30 or 35, they'll be no different than what you see today, other than we'll be reducing the speeds from 25 down to 20. So again, 30 minutes before the start of school, 30 minutes after the last bell, the flashing beacons will be displayed to alert motorists as to whether or not that's in effect or not. So, does that answer your question?
It did.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions for traffic engineer? Okay. Seeing none, thank you very much.
Thank you.
You, and we'll get the copy of the PowerPoint and the fact sheet to all of
Yay.
you as well, so.
Okay. And if I suggest, like you said, to go out into each quadrant, we did that with the LPS for the budget. We would have one in northeast, north, southeast, southwest. You'd skip northwest.
No, we wouldn't skip it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Anything else? We can adjourn this meeting, and we'll be back here at 2 o'clock for our directors meeting. Thank you.